Always enjoy spending some time with our friend Adam Schuster. He's the Director of Budget and Tax Research for Illinois Policy, illinoispolicy.org. And I've said this before, I will continue to. That's a site you need to bookmark. Visit frequently. Man, they populate that with some really, really great articles. And one of the things I love about Illinois Policy is they're not afraid to come in with a heavy-duty critique, but they always offer an alternative, a suggestion. They're not just ripping things apart and letting you figure it out from there. They've got their own ideas on how things ought to go, and they're generally pretty darn smart. Adam, good morning to you.
Good morning, Riley. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for being on the show. We really appreciate it. Interesting topic this morning, and that is how unprepared this state would be for the next recession. And now, that doesn't mean that there's one on the horizon, but they always do visit us, and we don't seem to really have our ducks in a row, do we?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So nobody can predict with any sort of certainty exactly when the next recession is going to hit. A number of economists are saying it could be as soon as the end of 2020. But what we're looking at now is trying to make sure that the state is prepared for the inevitable recession, because one will happen, sooner rather than later, probably. But it will happen again. And one of the things that we look at is what's called stress testing. And so when you stress test a state budget, that's exactly what we were talking about. How well prepared are you? And an analogy for your personal finances would be something like, you might have heard a rule of thumb that you should try to have 3 months of savings in case you have some sort of unexpected medical expense, or you unexpectedly lose your job, or whatever thing might happen you weren't planning for. And at the state level, they generally have a rule of thumb that a state should have 5% of its annual general revenue funds saved in reserves so that they can help use that to weather the next recession. In Illinois, that would be about $2 billion.
Okay.
And instead, at the end of the fiscal year, we had less than $90,000, which is essentially 0% savings.
Wait a minute. We're supposed to have $2 billion, yet when we count the beans, there's 90,000.
That's right. And so Illinois is one of the worst prepared states for the next recession. Both Moody's and S&P, which are ratings and analytics agencies, looked at this, and they both ranked Illinois in their bottom tier of states.
Yeah, the constant drumbeat of the downgrade from Moody's, who Standard & Poor's Global Ratings and Moody's both looked at it. And one thing in particular that we keep hearing about during one of these campaigns is the progressive tax. And apparently S&P and Moody's take a dim view.
Right. So the issue with a progressive tax as it relates to the stress testing is that progressive taxes make state income more volatile. So when there's a recession, there's two big things that happen. Revenue naturally goes down because the economy slows down, and spending on certain things naturally goes up, and actually automatically in some cases, like Medicaid, because there's more people putting demand for that state service. And with a progressive income tax, what happens is you have more volatility during a recession. So that means deeper dips during a recession. And the reason for that is because you're relying on a smaller number of people for a larger share of the state's revenue. And on top of that, it happens to be a revenue source that's more affected by an economic downturn because a lot of it is from investment income.
Okay. Well, yeah, as we mentioned, not really having our ducks in a row. We're spending time with Adam Schuster, Director of Budget and Tax Research for Illinois Policy. Well, tell me that at least, we've kind of gotten an idea that, we don't have all that much money. We got to make the most of it. So any spending practices that have been amended to make this an easier transition, or are we still doing the same thing that got us in the jam to begin with?
So, unfortunately, Illinois seems to be one of the few states that hasn't really learned its lesson. So, they do report. There's good news in these Moody's and S&P reports that overall states are better prepared for the next recession than they were for the 2008 recession. That general trend, unfortunately, is not holding in Illinois. In Illinois, we are worse prepared than we were for 2008 because we've had a decade of budget volatility where we can't even agree on how to pass a budget. We've had 2 different income tax hikes. And meanwhile, all of our neighboring states have managed to shore up their budgets while also reducing their income taxes. And we do have a way out. It's not all doom and gloom. There is time for the state to prepare as long as they get serious and start understanding these problems now. So what we're recommending is 2 things. One is a constitutional spending cap amendment, which I believe we talked about in the show before. And what that would do is it would tie growth in state spending to a long-run average of growth in the economy. So essentially, make sure politicians can't spend more than their taxpayers can afford. And the other thing is a constitutional amendment on pensions to allow changes to future benefits, the future rate of benefit increases, so that we can get a little bit more resources for the general budget, so it's not all being sucked up by this pension monster.
All of which, makes perfect sense, and I'm certain will be perfectly ignored by those in power. Well, let's compare and contrast, because, we're right here on the border with Wisconsin. How are they different in what they are doing and as far as prepping, rainy day, all that stuff than we are?
Sure. So Wisconsin actually is only in a little bit better position when it comes to their rainy day funds. They don't have a ton of reserves on hand either. But what they do have is a more dynamic economy and consistently balanced budgets over the last 10 years. So they're not starting with the same amount of debt, and they'll have a little bit easier time weathering the recession because they've still got more tools available to them.
Okay. I guess, misery-loving company, hearing that, well, they're not that much better than us. You feel a little bit better, but he still said better.
Yeah, and it's, having reserves on hand is only one aspect of, how well prepared you are. The other one is, think of the economy as the engine that allows state government to move, right? The economy is what's producing the revenue that state government takes in. And so with Wisconsin having a better economy than we have had lately, that enables them to have a little bit more flexibility when the next recession comes. So in Illinois, we've got a lot of, problems piling up on each other. We've got, a weak economy, fairly low growth. We've got a lot of people leaving the state, 4 straight years of population loss. And so when you add the budget troubles on top of that, that's where we really get into trouble. I mean, the Moody's ratings say that if there's a moderate recession, that will add to the imbalance in the state budget by about $4 billion. And if there's a severe recession, it'll be $6.8 billion. And so that's a lot of money that the state needs to plan for. And, really it's again, reserves is one aspect of it. But the other thing they look at is, well, how do states usually respond when there's a recession? Do they do structural reforms? Do they try to improve their economy? Do they make sure that their structural spending is in line with what they can actually afford? Or do they do sort of like accounting gimmicks and one-time measures just to try to make things make sense on paper? And historically, Illinois has fallen in that latter category, where we do things like we sweep money out of other funds, or we use sort of phony accounting to make things look balanced, even though we know they're not. And so it's a combination of, shoring up, getting that savings, but also just returning to sound budget making and responsible budget making.
And Adam, it seems like, with the information readily available that you provided Illinois policy that, Moody's and S&P came out with, I mean, that information alone should be enough to spur some sort of activity. Yet what it does seemingly is maybe spur a little bit more talking, but then when it quiets down, we go right back to what we were doing before.
I think you're critical here is that we can't let that happen. I mean, ultimately, the politicians in Springfield work for us. They work for the taxpayers. And taxpayers need to put consistent pressure on them to do the right thing, to do sound budgeting, to balance their budgets in the long term, to enact common sense reforms like pension reform and a constitutional spending cap. Because it's not too late. I mean, I know there's a lot of doom and gloom in this message, and that's sometimes what you get when you're being honest. Sometimes things are bad, and we still have time to prepare. We just need to get serious about it now. We need demand from our lawmakers that they do that.
Yeah, and getting people to pony up with the exact, honest truth about what's going on during an election cycle—that's any trick.
Yes, that's certainly the case. That this is the time of year when they'd rather not be talking about difficult issues like this. But it's important that we start getting our ducks in a row, as you put it, while we still got the time to do it. Because if we wait until there's a next recession, revenue is going to go down, Medicaid spending is going to go up, pension spending is going to go up, by the way, as well, when the investment returns get lower. And you're going to have all these, spending automatically going up, revenue automatically going down. And if we wait until then to try to figure out what to do about it, it's going to be much harder, and the pain's going to be much more severe than if we do a little bit of preparation now.